This is a video on all about the Manitoba residential offer to purchase form and what you should know about it. Stephen Olyniuk, Remax Performance Realty, and we'll go over here what it looks like and what gets filled out. Here's your buyer brokerage, and I usually have mine filled out already, so that just saved one step on it. Then in this line here, it'll have the listing brokerage and the listing salesperson. When we get down to these lines here, there's some confirmation of representation that needs to be checked off, and it's either the buyer and does not represent the seller, which sometimes you can have the buyer representing the seller and the buyer. That's called limited joint representation, and we'll get into that in further YouTube videos. So one of these needs to be checked off on the buy side of things, where the buyer does not represent the seller does not represent the buyer, and both parties with the consent, they represent each other. So you'll have the buyer initial here, and one of these three will be checked off, as well as the same thing for the sellers. The seller will initial here, and one of those three will be checked off. Buyer's initials will go right here. Seller's initials will go right here. Now, 2, this is meaning who the seller is. So that'll be the name of the seller and the address of the seller. Address of the seller can be different than the actual place that's being sold. Let's say it's a rental property, or their partnerships in a house. They may not live at that house, so their address can be different. You as the buyer, your name would go right here, and then your buyer address. Now, subject matter to the offer. Now, this is where the address of the property goes into right here. It inserts either the civic address or the legal description. Next thing, it goes into what may be excluded. Sometimes things that are included in a house, they may want to keep. And what's a good analogy of what's included? Well, just imagine you take a house, you tip it upside down, and whatever doesn't fall off, it's bolted to the house, that's what's included. So tricky things like TV wall mounts, they're screwed to it, and they should be included. So it should be written as an exclusion. Another real tricky thing can be bathroom mirrors. A lot of time bathroom mirrors could just be hanging on a nail. Realistically, they are not included then. So you could get the surprise of that bathroom mirror not being there when you get in there. We'll always write things in, and our lawyer tells us ink is cheap. If there's anything that you're thinking that you want included, it may be a gray area, write it in. Ink is cheap. Okay. So on this line, if there was things that they wanted to exclude that were bolted down, would be written there. On this line here, it's things that are usually included. Your fridge, stove, washer, dryer, things like those are usually what go in those lines. This line right here will get the amount of your offer, okay? And then right here, you'll get the amount of your deposit. And I always get asked, what's a good deposit amount? And it depends. Rural Manitoba is a little bit different. We see a lot lower deposits in there. In Winnipeg, we usually see 5 to 10% of the selling price as deposits. On the very low side of things, $5,000 seems to be the low side of a deposit. And then sometimes in this line, you'll have written within so many hours of acceptance. And the reason you see that is a lot of stuff is being done digitally now, digital signatures. So, in days gone past, before digital signatures were allowed, the offer would be signed right with the person there. You'd get a check from them. You'd submit all of that in. A lot of times everything's being sent in by email, so that it, you're not having it in your hands. Okay. The next thing is there an assumption of a mortgage? That really doesn't happen anymore. Everybody's trying to clear off the new mortgage and get a lower interest rate. As interest rates start coming up in years to come, we may see that come back again. Back in the day when there were 20% interest rates, people were ecstatic if they could get assume somebody's mortgage that was at a 12% or something like that, if you can imagine that. So then that's a different form of if there was a mortgage being assumed. The next line here is that this is something that should always be filled out. It should be how long is the term, what's the interest rate not to be exceeded, and what the approximate payment should be. If this stuff is not filled out and you try to get out of the deal because the financing didn't go through, financing condition, if you had a finance condition, the seller could come back to you and say, oh, we can get you financed at 19.9%, and they could kind of hold you to it. So again, ink is cheap. You should have the current interest rate written in here and the term and an approximate payment, just to save your butt. This one here, line will be filled out is when you are going to the lawyer's office just before possession date. It'll be whatever your cash to close is on it. So it'll probably be part of, let's say you put $10,000 down, but you were, I'm just going to use round numbers to keep it easy, and you were buying a $100,000 house, which is not possible anymore, but just to keep it easy, and you were going to be putting 20% down. So that's $20,000. If you're already putting 10 down, then your amount due at the lawyers would be $10,000 for that. Now, there are other things that your lawyer will talk to you about, and that is you're going to pay the taxes, which is left owing for the year on the property, and there is also land transfer taxes to be paid, and your lawyer's bill as well. And then if there's any other information that may be written on there that you need to fill in there, kind of gives you some areas to fill out. It can be different on every offer. And then again, with all of this added up, this will be your total price. Getting down to here is your possession. So you'll give the time, the date, and the month and the year. So we never like to do a possession on a Saturday or a Sunday, just for the simple fact, if there needs to be contact with the lawyer, most of them don't work on the Saturday or on the Sunday. As we get into other things here, you get that make sure that there's no structural or improvements that are encroaching. Make sure there's not a garage or a shed that's partially on other people's property. There also can be things about shared driveways, and that's more common in the rural properties. It's not different when you see a driveway come in and splits off, so they have a shared driveway agreement. Don't generally see that in the city, but it can happen. And then that all restriction and requirements registered against the property and the title. That with the zoning regulations, except for, so if there's something funny with the zoning regulations, it needs to be written in there. Additional promises, usually we'll have in this line here that all heating, cooling, electrical, mechanical appliances to be in working order on day of possession. Usually there's a none that goes in here on this line as well as that. We'll go over it in more detail as we're sitting in front of you there. Line 7, we get into property disclosure statements. And what a property disclosure statement, code name PDS is usually what they're called, is it's a 3-page form, asking things like, do you know of any structural issues? Do you know of any, has it been ever used as a marijuana grow up? Has there ever been any fires in it? Has there been any flooding? Has it ever been denied insurance? And that's answered to the best of their ability. So never take that as a warranty or a guarantee, because it's to the best of their ability. So that usually you'll see in there 48 hours for the sellers to get that over to you. And then this line here, usually it's 48 hours for you to look it over, either sign it or deny it and get that back to them. If it accompanies the offer already, then this line gets crossed out and it gets initialed. If it does not, this line gets crossed out and gets initialed. Then we get down to some conditions in here. Your main condition you usually see is a mortgage condition by a certain date. And the next one usually you'll see is a home inspection condition, and that's always at the expense of the buyer. And then what usually you see for condition in here can be anything that can be written in, but the most common is if they had a house to sell before they can purchase that one. So it would say subject to the sale of 1234 ABC Street by such and such a date, because all conditions need a date on them, a drop dead date. Conditions benefiting the seller. Usually what we'll see in here is none, but sometimes you can see that a seller will request a certain type of closing, or they may have other requests, and that'll be written in there. Buyer's initials will go at the bottom here, seller's initials there. And then mutual promises, you can, again, we'll go through and we'll read this all at that time. And this is something that survives closing. So usually our 4B will go in there, which is your heating, cooling, and, on day of possession, it's good working order, your appliances, because that is surviving after the date of closing. Another one that you can go in there is, what if there's a pool and you're buying this in the wintertime? You want to make sure that when you open this pool up, that it was closed properly and that everything is functioning properly. So sometimes you'll see that pool to be in good working condition by, May 30th or something like that. Representation by the broker. If the broker has guaranteed you something, it goes in there 99.9% of the time. There should be a none written in there. And then the deadline for the sellers to accept this offer. In 15, we usually like to have in there in other terms that to supply existing surveyor certificate and zoning memorandum if available. A lot of times they're not available, and we're seeing that surveyor certificates aren't even being used anymore because they're using a title closing protocol closing, which speaks title insurance on there, and we can get into more detail about that too as well. Buyer signs this and we put the time in. It's witnessed by the realtor, buyer signature, and buyer's initials, seller's initials. Now on this page, there's nothing for a buyer to do except at the very bottom to initial there. And I just have them initial for the simple fact, if the offer is accepted as written, it'll come back here, accepted as written. If they do a counter offer, it's going to say counter offer, and at that point, it'll tell you what the counter offer is, and anything written in that counter offer, price to be this, condition to be this, possession date to be this. Anything written in here supersedes anything previous in the offer. At that point, for it to be accepted, a buyer actually has to sign it. So it's not accepted just by this initial at the bottom. It has to be signed. And the seller, whether they write, offer accepted as written, counter offer to be, or respectfully declined, the seller needs to witness, or seller needs to sign it, and it needs to be witnessed by the selling signature and dated as well. Homestead Act. This comes into play if one of the persons, let's say a husband or wife, isn't on title, but that's their primary residence, well, then they do have Homestead Act rights. And so this part needs to be filled out too as well. So that is an offer to purchase. And if you have any questions on that, don't ever hesitate to reach out to us and ask us any question. We'd like people to see what an offer to purchase looks like before they're putting in an offer, so that at that time they're not going, well, what is this and what's it all about? Hope you have a fantastic day, and be watching for more of our videos on the buying process.